My sincerest greetings, once again, to the empty void of the internet. I'm aware that, for now and for a long time, my writings are going to go largely unnoticed until there's some freak accident that brings attention to this channel, which is the testimony that I hear repeated by the various YouTube starlets that have come and gone over the years. It's all a game of luck, they say, or a game of feeding the algorithm what it wants, in cases like one Jimmy Beast. Perhaps it's actually best for me to branch out and do something interesting, instead of just offering essays for a small group of English nerds to watch, like joining the circus or going to court, but those are ambitions for another day. In truth, I think the key to success is time, and that in time I may prosper in some way, shape, or form. I was told by one of my professors last year that my time will come, only if I trust that it will, kicking, screaming, and going hungry, fighting an uphill battle until that day comes. And I do believe that it will come, but when is impossible to tell. As it happens, I've become obsessed with the concept of time over the past few months, and I've learned about various methods to qualify and understand time in a few different contexts, though history is probably the most apparent one. Time is also a deeply important facet in literature, omnipresent in the background of every text, as it is in reality, but there's a handful of novels which stretch the concept of time to its extremes, and sometime soon I'll do a video about how those books can help us understand some of the realities of time more clearly. Not to mention, I've also spent the entire year reading literature from Indigenous authors, and in those books, time plays a central role as a vehicle that can be shifted and manipulated to draw parallels between moments in history, or to even reshape history as we know it, or to use the past as a way to investigate potential futures. So, I'm not only interested in the past and how it's come to shape the present world, but I'm interested in investing in the future as it stands, choosing for the first time ever in my life to be an optimist. I've learned from studying both Black and Indigenous literature the existence of a genre known as Futurism, a genre that primarily includes texts but does expand into every corner of art. Futurism, as I understand it, is an optimistic view of the future that takes into account the struggles of the past, suggesting that change is possible if not inevitable, and that agents of change have the capacity to lift us out of our struggle and into a brighter future. It was specifically Afrofuturism in the 90s that kickstarted this whole genre, which more accurately encompasses an entire school of thought, though you can find Afrofuturist texts from well before 1990. Typically, Afrofuturism is most identifiable in the form of science fiction that centers Black characters in a Black world written by Black authors. So think Black Panther, or pick any book from Octavia Butler. I've picked up this novella, Arcdust, from the independent Black publisher Bill Campbell at Rosarium Publishing, and I've only read the first chapter, but the prose is incredible and gripping from the very first sentence. If you're looking for contemporary Afrofuturist literature, absolutely get it from Rosarium. It's also worth noting that there's a substantial pool of Afrofuturist music out there, from Janelle Monáe to Flying Lotus to Standing on the Corner. Music is probably the most accessible avenue for many people to be exposed to Afrofuturism, but I'm not a music critic, and I have to save my discussion of the rap game for another day. Anyway, Afrofuturism is generally accepted as the first BIPOC futurist genre, rooted in Black American history and specifically concerned with the Black future of America and abroad. Naturally, this means that Afrofuturist literature is irrevocably situated within Black culture, and primarily intended for Black audiences. Afrofuturist works incorporate messages and morals for their Black audience to promote an optimistic, forward-thinking, and socially conscious school of thought, as I mentioned earlier, while simultaneously just being quality literature all the while, though this shouldn't come as a surprise. Though the term itself is much more modern, Afrofuturism was a quintessential part of the Harlem Renaissance, a period of great transition in Black history, out of the seemingly unstoppable regime of slavery and into new, brighter futures in the North, which saw Black artists rise and shine, paving the way for slow but steady social upheaval that is, in many ways, still in progress. This is precisely the thesis that's found within Elaine Locke's cornerstone work, written in 1925, which you can check out on the Internet Archive. The link is in the description. Now, it's important to know that this book uses some old language, and I've altered these quotes slightly to avoid being cancelled. To begin, Locke identifies the social standing of Black folks in the recent past, during Reconstruction and during slavery, finding that, for generations in the mind of America, Black people have been more of a formula than a human being, a something to be argued about, condemned or defended, to be kept down or in his place, or helped up, to be worried with or worried over, harassed or patronized, a social boogie or a social burden. Locke understood well that Blackness, and prejudice against Blackness, was rooted in a deep and tangled network of constructs, which is precisely what led to the understanding of Black people as a formula, and not as a collective that could one day constitute a whole society and culture. Hitherto, it must be admitted that Black Americans have been a race more in name than in fact, or, to be exact, more in sentiment than in experience. The chief bond between them has been that of a common condition rather than a common consciousness, a problem in common rather than a life in common. Locke distills exactly the conditions present during the era of slavery, which was the coalescence of a wide variety of black peoples and cultures into a single monolithic category, simply called black, who are bonded together more by the mere effect of being enslaved rather than having consciously built bridges to create black culture. Thus, as you might expect, and indeed one of the goals of slavery was, to demoralize this black monolith, and to eradicate individual cultures and simplify the black masses into being defined by their bondage and not being defined by their personhood, nor their true diversity. Following the abolition of slavery, free black people had the ability to form their own black American culture without the dictation of white masters. This new freedom resulted in the Harlem Renaissance, which was preceded by the Great Migration, which played its own significant role in the formation of black culture. Locke notes that, in the very process of being transplanted, black people are becoming transformed. Simply the movement out of the South and away from plantations and newly destitute and wild former masters created the opportunity to spring forth into a new era of black existence and culture, where the black mind seems suddenly to have slipped from under the tyranny of social intimidation and to be shaking off the psychology of imitation and implied inferiority. By shedding the old chrysalis of the black problem, we are achieving something like a spiritual emancipation. The vital inner grip of prejudice has been broken. This is where Alain Locke is located in time, in the moment of newfound freedom before the spiritual emancipation has fully taken wing, but, and this is where the futurism comes in, Locke can see what is coming on the horizon, which is the whole point of penning this essay and releasing it as the front matter to one of the first anthologies of Black American literature. With this renewed self-respect and self-dependence, the life of the black community is bound to enter a new dynamic phase, the buoyancy from within compensating for whatever pressure there may be of conditions from without. Locke can see the blossoms of the Harlem Renaissance unfurl, even when it was still mostly just a bud, and created an essay which encourages any and all black people who have the talent to create, to sculpt black history with self-determination, to rise from the ashes of slavery and to create a new image, to cut that baggage loose and conceive of black culture as the future, no longer dictated by devious, sniveling crackers. In truth, I could be a cracked pot calling Alain Locke an Afrofuturist, but I like historical texts, and I really think that there's a case for considering him as part of futurist canon. Oftentimes, futurism comes in the form of science fiction, so it's a little tangential to call a nonfiction essay from the Roaring Twenties a piece of Afrofuturism, but there's always a theoretical basis of nonfiction that accompanies that outpouring of science fiction, which puts those theories into practice. The same is true of indigenous futurisms, which stems from Afrofuturism and uses some of the same key concepts that we've just discussed, but applied in a different context. Indigenous Futurisms, plural, was formalized in 2012 with this anthology, Walking the Clouds, though, again, Indigenous Futurist texts existed well before 2012. This text is also available in the Internet Archive, same as Locke. Let's take a look inside this text, which was the anchor point for the establishment of Indigenous Futurisms. And just like Locke's anchor work, we're going to be dealing with Grace Dillon's essay, which serves as the front matter for this anthology of native sci-fi. Right off the bat, Dillon acknowledges that the title, Walking the Clouds, also pays homage to Afrofuturisms, an established topic of study for science fiction scholars, making the lineage of the genre clear from the get-go. As we'll come to find out, there are a plethora of new concepts found in Indigenous Futurisms, but the basic assumptions of both futurist strains remain the same. The acknowledgement of a dark past as the exigence for a renewed survival and sovereign triumph. Dillon clarifies this connection, though, citing Mark Boole's introduction to a recent special edition of Science Fiction Studies, which frames the matter. What's intended is not relegating Afrofuturisms to a purely science fiction field, but rather recognizing that science fiction theory and Afrofuturisms may have much to gain by the exchange. The same is true of the approach here. Indigenous Futurisms does make its home in the realm of science fiction, but has a relational connection to Afrofuturism, which, as mentioned previously, spans a wide variety of genres, though Indigenous Futurism does this too. Regardless, we're really talking about science fiction now, so let's not get it twisted. Grace Dillon expresses that science fiction provides an equally valid way to renew, recover, and extend First Nations peoples' voices and traditions, by blending mainstream sci-fi mechanics and themes with indigenous ones, in order to re-enlist the science of indigeneity in a discourse that invites discerning readers to realize that indigenous science is not just complementary to a perceived Western Enlightenment, but is indeed integral to a refined 21st century sensibility. This is really the key point, in my opinion. that it is necessary to incorporate indigenous ways of knowing into common parlance, since it does so much to contextualize America and the realities of our settler colonial nation. Native sci-fi stories enclose reservation realisms in a fiction that sometimes fuses indigenous sciences with the latest scientific theories available in public discourse, and sometimes undercuts the Western limitations of science altogether. Reading native sci-fi is probably the fastest track one can take to expanding your worldview, since native contexts, culture, ways of knowing, and the people themselves have been eradicated and swept under the rug. And you can go your whole life living in America and never encounter a native person, nor their ideas. Learning and sharing native literature is critical, not only to the survival of indigenous futurisms, but similarly critical to fully understanding what decolonization means and looks like in America. Indigenous futurisms goes a long way in showing the shortcomings of Western science, philosophy, and literature, but a full comparison between the two is a video for another day. For now, let's focus on introducing a few of these new topics that are present in native science fiction. Let's start with the entire reason I decided to make this video: native slipstream. Dylan outlines that native slipstream is a species of speculative fiction within the science fiction realm, confused with stories of time travel, alternate realities and multiverses, and alternative histories. As its name implies, slipstream views time as pasts, presents, and futures that flow together like currents in a navigable stream. It thus replicates nonlinear thinking about space-time. It's critical to know that this view of time as a navigable river is not restrained to just fiction, but stems from a genuine indigenous concept of time, which challenges the Western notions that time is strictly linear, with a past you cannot revisit and a future that can never be known. In other words, it is intended to describe writing that does not simply seem avant-garde, but models a cultural experience of reality. Not only did this concept of slipstream time already exist within indigenous ways of knowing and experiencing, it's also an ancient conception which holds its conversation with the current obsession with multiverses. Native slipstream thinking, which has been around for millennia, anticipated recent cutting-edge physics, ironically suggesting that natives have had things right all along. The closest approximation in quantum mechanics is the concept of the multiverse, which posits that reality consists of a number of simultaneously existing alternate worlds and/or parallel worlds. Obviously, this isn't to say that there's an MCU-style comic book universe of native superheroes that vastly predates even written language, although that would be rad. Rather, native slipstream exploits the possibilities of multiverses by reshaping time travel, allowing authors to recover the native space of the past, to bring it to the attention of contemporary readers, and to build better futures. It captures moments of divergence and the consequences of that divergence. The first piece of slipstream reading that I encountered, which is contained within this book by the way, is Gerald Visner's Custer on the Slipstream, originally published in 1978. It sees George Armstrong Custer reincarnated as a blithering bureaucrat who explicitly preys on indigenous communities for his own personal gain, climbing the ladder of the U.S. Department of Labor. This reincarnated Custer is essentially shunned into non-existence, disappearing from the historical record in the recent and the past, by the dual reincarnation of Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, who delivers a smackdown of a speech in 3 different time periods, outlining that the white man needs natives to keep poor and profit off of, while the natives could get rid of the white man and be better for it. This short story begins to unravel the heroic narrative about Custer from the Battle of Little Bighorn, and makes it clear that Custer was a loathsome, devious loser. Speaking of Little Bighorn, Indigenous Futurisms has a completely different outlook on American history, including, most crucially, the concept of apocalypse. In the modern American lens, apocalypse is most seriously understood as nuclear apocalypse. You know, the Cold War and the Red Scare and the Cuban Missile Crisis, the second Cuban Missile Crisis. See, apocalypse is always identifiable based around certain points in history, which is where science fiction steps in to forge an alternate history around those circumstances. Such alternate histories often have well-known cataclysms, including the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864, the Battle of Little Bighorn and Custer's demise in 1876, the Ghost Dances after the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890, and the Oka uprisings of the 1990s at Kane Sarasake. Because there are so many examples of cataclysmic violence perpetrated against Native Americans, it is most commonplace to think that the Native apocalypse, if contemplated seriously, has already taken place. Many forms of indigenous futurisms posit the possibility of an optimistic future by imagining a reversal of circumstances, where natives win, or are at least centered in the narrative. This is exactly how Slipstream and Apocalypse go hand in hand, where narrative science fiction goes back over these histories of devastation and reimagines them from the indigenous perspective, recasting the colonial knight-errant as a pathetic bitch, or reframing what colonial history considers an end as only the beginning of a completely new story. But wait, Let's pause for a moment to clarify one possible native conception of apocalypse, in contrast to its association with the biblical canon. Lawrence Gross contends that Anishinaabe culture is recovering from what he calls post-apocalypse stress syndrome, and describes apocalypse as the state of being akwasi, Anishinaabe for he or she is sick, and more to the point, out of balance. Native apocalypse is really that state of imbalance. Using indigenous terminology to describe indigenous futurisms is really the key to understanding what's going on with native texts, and provides a bevy of terms to give depth to the ones that we're already familiar with, like apocalypse. With this understanding of akwasi, being out of balance, native apocalyptic storytelling, then, shows the ruptures, the scars, and the trauma in its effort ultimately to provide healing and a return to Bimidazuen. This is the path to a sovereignty embedded in self-determination. See, and it all neatly wraps around into the basics of Afrofuturism, while taking a completely different route to get there. Okay, I want to introduce one more piece of Anishinaabe terminology, and this is quite possibly the most important one, Biskabiong. It may go without saying that all forms of indigenous futurisms are narratives of Biskabiong, an Anishinaabe word connoting the process of returning to ourselves, which involves discovering how personally one is affected by colonization, discarding the emotional and psychological baggage carried from its impact, and recovering ancestral traditions in order to adapt in our post-native apocalypse world. When people talk about decolonization, the conversation usually involves an investigation into how to undo the evils of white hegemony, but I find that Biskabiong is a much easier place to start that conversation from. Returning to oneself, understanding and embracing where you came from, particularly in a native context, simultaneously implies a rebuke of colonized cultures and methods. This process is often called decolonization. As Linda Tuhiwai Smith explains, it requires changing rather than imitating Euro-Western concepts. As we've just discussed with native slipstream thinking, as well as native apocalypse, there have been indigenous dialogues about modern topics that extend much farther back into the well of traditional knowledge, and drawing on that knowledge can help us understand how to really start achieving colonization. The answer of what to do next has always lied within indigenous ways of knowing and living. Additionally, decolonization should be recognized as at least tangential to post-colonial science fiction literature as a whole, and central to indigenous futurisms as a path to Biskabiong. Returning to yourself and decolonization are reciprocal, an ongoing process that aims to re-immerse indigenous people today within indigenous ways of being, to grow and promote these systems as a means to guarantee an indigenous future, led by indigenous people. In the end, Walking the Clouds returns us to ourselves by encouraging native writers to write about native conditions in native-centered worlds, liberated by the imagination. But I'm a chronologist. Though I've studied Black and Indigenous futurisms, and do plan to discuss them further because we've only scratched the surface, I definitionally cannot be called an Afrofuturist, nor an Indigenous futurist. See, I'm not sure if you've noticed, because there's always a chance that this is our first acquaintance, so I'll admit that I'm super white, like undeniably and unambiguously white. I can't contribute meaningfully to these conversations by virtue of being white, though it is absolutely valuable to know about, read, and support BIPOC futurists, because they are genuinely paving the future as we speak. I believe in the futurist ideal that foregrounds Black and Indigenous theorists, artists, and creatives in general, an ideal that decenters white voices as a means to decolonize academic and fine art institutions, as well as the forum of the internet in general. So then, what am I really doing here? If these futurisms are advocating for a wave of self-determined Black and Indigenous authors, what the fuck am I doing as another white bitch on YouTube relaying a message that wasn't meant for me to begin with? Well, truly, my mission is solidarity above all else. There's nothing that I can do to change the color of my skin, nor my heritage, but I've taken the time to become educated about the colonial reality, and I subscribe to the futurisms that encourage decolonization, and I believe that transgenders of all colors play a role in that. I'm not naive to the fact that my audience may be overwhelmingly white, or that I may reach a wider audience because of my whiteness, but I want to use those variables to my advantage as best as possible. It's critical for white folks to be reading these authors and supporting Black and Indigenous futurisms, because the awareness of colonization within the white captive mind is just one of the many faces of the decolonial project. I understand my role as a purveyor of futurisms, not a creator of them. Part of why I picked out Alain Locke as an Afrofuturist is because his thoughts about race relations in 1925 are still pertinent almost exactly 100 years later. Locke found that the most unsatisfactory feature of our present stage of race relationships in America is namely the fact that the more intelligent and representative elements of the two race groups have at so many points been quite out of vital touch with one another. For progress to be made, there needs to be a connection between the educated amongst us, and by utilizing the power of the internet, broadcasting those discourses into the public to increase learning and activism surrounding decolonization and beyond. However, this is not enough. Locke also knew that there is a growing realization that in social effort, the cooperative basis must supplant long-distance philanthropy, and that the only safeguard for mass relations in the future must be provided in the carefully maintained contacts of the enlightened minorities of both groups. Through YouTube, as a decentralized platform, we need to form communities that fight back against hegemonic injustice, and to take it the next step further by bringing those communities into physical being. I'm aware that this is a pretty big dream, but Futurisms has taught me that we are often far more powerful than we think, but only if we believe in that power to incite change. But if I myself can't be an Afrofuturist, where does that leave me, if not just as a regurgitator of smarter people's ideas? Well, I have my own literary genre to defend. There isn't such a well-defined field of queer futurisms, but there's a sort of unspoken contingency of trans women on YouTube who bring the joys of literature and philosophy to the masses, and I most certainly belong to that crowd. The transgender community rose, came to prominence, and became a specific social threat due to the internet, and someone's got to keep the show going on YouTube. At no other point in history have trans women been in such a limelight, with recognizable faces, celebrity gossip, and all the rest. Part of why I made my last, and coincidentally first, video was because I believe that YouTube has really serious influence on discourse and culture at large, at least among younger people. Boomers are an entirely lost cause at this point, I'm afraid. Transgender voices became prominent in the digital age, and we need to stay prominent, lest we lose a foothold during our struggle for existence that's happening concurrently and often intersecting with Black and Indigenous struggles. Indeed, Locke knows that it is the man furthest down who is the most active in getting up. So you can consider what I'm doing here as rising from the grave of the man that I once was, and I want to pull as many people up with me as possible. However, I haven't really explained what I mean when I say that I'm a chronologist. Indeed, time itself is at the center of my interests, and Futurisms only plays a part in that discussion, though truly I think it's the most productive branch of those discussions. I provided a crash course on Futurisms here in order to foreground a more in-depth conversation about time within literature at large, which usually involves Futurisms in some manner, but not always. As well, I took a class dedicated to Indigenous Futurisms in the spring, and I just think that the genre is awesome and full of amazing literature that everyone should read. Okay, but the chronologist thing. In part, I'm playing a joke and calling a shot long before it happens, but in earnest, I'm planning on talking about time very often in my videos, and I would sort of love to revive the term chronologist as a way to describe myself and the work that I do. Certainly, I'm going to have to earn that title, but I'm willing to put in the work for it. In a few videos, I'll be making good on this promise to explore my first original theoretical concept, generational crunch. Thanks for watching my second video. If any of this discussion about Futurisms has interested you, I have some book recommendations to make. Absolutely go and read Chelsea Vowell's Buffalo is the New Buffalo, an anthology of sci-fi short stories that is thought-provoking and entertaining the whole way through. Also, as I mentioned in the video, go give Alex Smith's Arc Dust a try. It's a fast-paced black cyberpunk novella that pulls no punches and presents a grim dystopia in vivid color. If there are any futurist works that you'd like to recommend to the blank void of the internet, leave a comment about it. And if you're not subscribed already, you should be. At the time of recording, I have 2 subscribers. One is my professor, and the other is my editor. So to be honest, I'm kind of hoping that I'll have 3 subscribers for my 3rd video. I'm going to be talking about the massive plagiarism scandal that happened across the video essay community a few months back, and maybe that'll get some views, but maybe I do actually need to join the circus in order to pop off. Okay, I think that's all I've got. Peace.